So far, we've assumed that the mobile application always had to be connected to the web server in order to work, to access the REST services, and through them, the database hosted on the server. However, GeneXus also allows us to create mobile applications that can work partially connected or even completely disconnected from the web server. Next, we'll study these cases. Let's review the concepts around connected applications. Online applications are those that must always be connected to the internet in order to retrieve data and work with it. When the device is offline, the app will only be able to work with cached data, and it won't be able to browse new screens or update the data. The application needs to access the web server's service layer in order to run the data providers that return the data and also the business components that perform CRUD operations over the database. The data cannot be obtained without an internet connection because there isn't a local database and all the data is on the server. Now let's see the case of partially connected applications. It may happen that part of the application keeps running when it's disconnected from the internet, while the other part of the application must stay connected in order to work. This is the case of the event day application, because we'll want the user to continue viewing the entire conference schedule and all the related information, even when there's no internet connection. Then, when the connection is restored, the application will automatically update the data, which will be stored in a local database on the device, and then synchronizing it with the server to receive updated data. Since the user may have marked some sessions as favorites, it will also send this information to the server during the synchronization process, updating the central database. However, some tasks will require accessing the web server, whether due to their sensitivity or due to the frequency with which the data has changed. These tasks must be executed online. Therefore, we can select which objects of the application can be executed offline and which cannot. Applications of this type will be called partially connected or standalone applications. They provide access to local data and the ability to execute complex logic on the same device. Here, note that the structure of the centralized database on the server that's managed by the mobile application is mirrored on the device. This is to say, an SQLite local database will be created on the device with the same tables. Now, let's talk about applications that can work completely disconnected from the internet. In the first case, when the connection is reestablished, synchronization with the central database takes place. In the second case, we may not be interested in running the app's synchronization because we want it to be completely independent from the data on the server. Everything would be managed from the device, as the app installed on it wouldn't communicate with the server. The third case is when we want the device to be able to receive the changes made on the centralized database, but then never to send its own changes, which will be saved in the local database. These applications that can work without an internet connection are called offline applications. But how do we build an offline application using GeneXus? If we want an application to run offline, we must set the connectivity support property of its main object to the value offline. This value makes it possible to generate the application offline. Also, the necessary native code will be generated for the application to run without invoking the REST services of the web server. Once a main object's connectivity support property is set to offline, when the application is installed on the device, the local database is created, and the necessary tables are created there. The connectivity support property is also at the level of objects not set as main. Its value can be online, offline, or inherit. All the tables that have the connectivity support property set to inherit, used in SD objects invoked from the main object, directly or indirectly, then will be created in the local database of the device. If they're set to be online, the table will not be created in the local database, because the server table will be accessed through REST services. The inherit value is displayed only in objects not set as main. In addition, the connectivity support property set to offline can be assigned to an object. In this case, the tables will be created in the local database, and the object will work offline, even if the main object works online. This is the end of the introduction. In the next video, we'll talk about the architecture of offline applications in more detail.